There's a man sitting in a prison interview room in New York. He's been inside for over 30 years. A forensic psychiatrist is sitting across from him and asks him a question. Of all the women you encountered, why did some of them live and some of them die? The man pauses. He pauses because he's actually trying to work it out. Like the answer is somewhere in there and he just needs a moment to locate it. And then he says, some of them couldn't satisfy me. Some of them ridiculed me. So I decided they weren't going to live. The psychiatrist later said what stayed with him wasn't what the man said. It was the stare, this flat, searching stare. Like a man who has spent 30 years confused about why everyone around him finds what he did so hard to process. That man is Joel Rifkin, New York's most prolific serial killer. 17 women, 4 years. And the thing that finally stopped him was a missing license plate. We'll get there. Joel Rifkin was born January 20th, 1959, in New York City. His biological parents were 2 college students who couldn't keep him. So 3 weeks after he was born, on Valentine's Day, and yes, that is the actual date, he was adopted by a couple on Long Island, Bernard and Jean Rifkin. Decent people, stable home, good neighborhood. They adopted a daughter a few years later. From the outside, the family looked thoroughly ordinary. It was. That's the part that makes this harder to explain. From the moment Joel started school, something was off. Hard to put your finger on, hard to explain, but consistently, quietly off. He had dyslexia nobody caught, so every day in a classroom was its own private ordeal. Reading aloud was a humiliation. Exams were a wall he couldn't get over, no matter how hard he tried. He walked with a slow, loping slouch, slightly wrong in a way that was hard to name, but impossible not to notice. His classmates called him the turtle. They excluded him from everything with the kind of casual, sustained efficiency that children are uniquely capable of. Low-level, day-after-day exclusion that over years hollows a person out in ways that don't show on the surface. One of those classmates was asked about him years later. What they said was that Joel was subtly obnoxious, that his presence annoyed you before you could explain why. They weren't saying it to be cruel. They were just describing what they remembered, accurately. And that's the thing. They probably never thought about him again after he left school. He thought about them. His father Bernard was a structural engineer, precise, accomplished, a man who understood how things were supposed to fit together. He sat with Joel for hours over homework and tried. He tried, properly, patiently, for years. But the gap between his son's potential and Joel tested above average IQ and what his son could actually produce on a page was a source of frustration Bernard couldn't entirely conceal. Joel noticed. Joel always noticed things like that. He was building an internal ledger from a very young age, cataloguing every moment where he fell short, every moment where someone else registered his inadequacy, without quite saying it out loud. His mother, Jeanne, was different, warmer. She shared his love of photography and gardening, 2 things that suited him, 2 areas where his patience and attention to detail were genuine assets rather than liabilities. With her, he felt something close to competent. But she couldn't follow him to school. She couldn't sit beside him in the classroom or in the lunch hall or on the sports field where the exclusion happened daily. And the name, the turtle, followed him from one year to the next. Chronic social rejection in adolescence activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain doesn't meaningfully distinguish between being hit and being humiliated repeatedly in front of people whose opinion matters to you. In most people, those circuits find somewhere else to go, another source of identity, something they're good at, someone who sees them differently. In some people, they don't. And what happens instead is the external world becomes a place that causes pain, and the internal world becomes the only place that doesn't. And in that internal world, the person controls everything. Joel Rifkin built an internal world. He started building it early, and he built it carefully, and it was violent from the very first brick. By early adolescence, the sexual fantasies he was having were not the ordinary vague longing of a teenage boy. They were detailed. They featured real people, the girls at school who laughed at him, the ones who looked straight through him. In the fantasy, he had total control. In the fantasy, nobody walked away. He told nobody this. To the outside world, he was just a quiet kid who liked photography and gardening. He was good at waiting. He had been practicing since he was old enough to be left out. Then, in 1972, he watched Hitchcock's Frenzy. He was 13. It's a film about a man who strangles women. Something in the specific mechanics of it, the power, the control, didn't disturb him. It settled something, clicked into place like a key in a lock he didn't know he had. He became fixated on strangulation, on prostitutes in particular. He started building a private archive of newspaper clippings about serial killers who targeted sex workers, studying them carefully, deliberately, the way you study something you're planning to eventually do. He was 13 years old, building an archive, planning. His parents gave him a car at 17. He drove to Hempstead, found sex workers, then Manhattan as his range extended, and in those transactions, brief, commercial, his money for their compliance, he found the only form of control his life had ever reliably given him. Nobody assessed him in those encounters. Nobody found him lacking. The balance was simple, and it worked. He got robbed regularly. The women and their associates took his money consistently. He went back anyway. It was never really about the sex. It was about the moment before it ended and reality came back. He was trying to stay inside that moment as long as possible, and the real world kept pulling him out. Violent fantasy in men like this doesn't stay still. It starts as a refuge, somewhere to go when the outside world is painful. But over time, it needs more to produce the same effect. And real encounters with sex workers can approximate the fantasy, but they can't fully reproduce it, because those women are actual people with their own will and their own responses, and their personhood keeps interrupting the script running in his head. That gap between what the fantasy promises and what reality delivers doesn't narrow over time, it widens, and eventually the mind starts working on the problem of the gap. The solution it arrives at is to remove the interruption, remove the will, remove the person. That process had been running in Joel Rifkin for 15 years before he acted on it. He drifted through 3 colleges without completing anything. Nassau Community, Brockport, Farmingdale. He studied horticulture at Farmingdale and actually did reasonably well. Patience and detail orientation suited the subject. He and his mother both loved gardening, and for a brief period, it looked like he'd found something that worked. He didn't finish that either. He later used the horticulture background to start a landscaping business. He used the landscaping business to store bodies. 2 facts about the same man sitting in the same sentence. Through his 20s, he rotated between low-paid jobs he couldn't hold and the family home in East Meadow. A manager at a record store he briefly worked at described him as a man who couldn't count to 10. Said plainly, as a factual observation, the man could not count to 10. He also maintained a meticulously organized private library dedicated to the study of serial killers and their methods. So the picture was more layered than the record store manager knew. His father Bernard, watching his son fail at things that seemed basic, struggled to hide his frustration. Joel absorbed all of it without visibly reacting. He had been absorbing things without visibly reacting his entire life. He was exceptionally good at it. February 20th, 1987. Bernard Rifkin, suffering from prostate cancer, chose to end his life on his own terms, rather than endure what was coming. Joel delivered the eulogy. People who were there said the grief was genuine, that he wept, that he meant what he said. Whatever existed in the deepest chambers of Joel Rifkin's interior, his love for his father appears to have been one of the few things in there that was uncomplicated. 6 months after the funeral, he was arrested for soliciting an undercover officer in Hempstead. He paid the fine, told nobody, moved his search for sex workers entirely to Manhattan where nobody knew his face. And around this same time, he shifted what he was reading. He stopped studying what serial killers had done. He started studying how they'd been caught, what mistakes had exposed them, what had given them away, what the gap between getting away with it and not getting away with it actually looked like in practice. He was not fantasizing anymore. He was preparing. February 20th, 1989, 2 years to the day after his father's death. Whether that date meant something to him or arrived at by coincidence is something he's never clearly addressed. He brought a woman back to the family home in East Meadow. His mother was out that night. Her name was Heidi Bauch. She was 25 years old. She had no idea the man sitting across from her had been building toward this moment for 15 years. He had sex with her. Then he beat her. Then he put his hands around her throat and held on until she stopped moving. What happened in the hours that followed is where you start to understand the particular quality of Joel Rifkin's mind. He didn't flee. He didn't fall apart. He sat with what he'd done, and then he started managing it, calmly, unhurriedly, with the same focused patience he'd brought to gardening and photography, and the careful study of other men's mistakes. He removed her teeth. He removed her fingertips, one by one, because dental records and fingerprints are how an unknown body gets a name, and he was not going to allow that. He put her head in a paint can, drove to a golf course in Hopewell, New Jersey, left it in the woods near the 7th hole. Her legs went into a creek in Pequannock. Her torso and arms went into the East River. 2 states, multiple disposal sites, every part of it planned in advance. A golfer found the paint can in March 1989. He reported it to police. It was logged. And that was where it stayed. An unidentified set of remains attached to nothing and nobody, filed and left. Heidi Balch was not formally identified until 2013, 24 years later. The people who loved her had been living with a missing persons report and silence for over 2 decades. Some of them never got an answer in their lifetime. That wasn't a side effect of what he did. It was the designed outcome. He had read enough to know exactly how to produce it. Later, in a prison interview, he said he had killed Heidi Balch with a theory in mind, that if he killed a prostitute, maybe he would stop soliciting them, that the act itself would function as a cure. He said this as though it was a reasonable hypothesis he had tested. It wasn't. The compulsion didn't empty. It sharpened. And it came back faster than it had arrived the first time. He went back to his life, drove his mother's car, looked for work, came home, sat in the same house where Heidi Balch had died, and waited for the pull to build again. It didn't take long. In 1990, he killed a woman named Julie Blackbird. What he reached for first wasn't his hands. It was a table leg. He beat her with it repeatedly, and when that didn't kill her, he strangled her. He dismembered her body and weighted the remains in buckets before dropping them into the East River and a canal in Brooklyn. The weighted buckets were a direct response to something he'd noticed. Things hadn't sunk the way he expected after the first murder. He thought about it in the months between, fixed it. He was improving his process the way someone improves any task they take seriously. There's a reason killers who target women living on the margins stay invisible for so long, and it has very little to do with how clever they are. It's structural. Women in sex work, women without stable housing, women who move frequently and exist at the edges of official records. When they go missing, it takes longer for anyone to formally notice. The reports come in late. The investigations open slowly and stall fast. Cases almost never connect across different jurisdictions because the information isn't gathered and compared in the same place at the same time. Rifkin had studied this dynamic for years. He understood it clearly. He chose every single one of his victims with full awareness of what that gave him: time and room to keep going. He actually said it himself. In a 2011 interview, he told the camera, "I killed prostitutes because they had no one. No lasting relationships. No family who cared. No one would ever come looking for them." That statement, delivered calmly on television, was wrong on every count. People came looking. Families filed reports and called investigators and waited by phones for years. The looking just didn't find anything, because he had made sure of that. In 1991, he started the landscaping business, Joel Rifkin Landscaping, the actual name, on actual paperwork, attached to a man who was actively killing people. He had a truck with a legitimate reason to be on the road at any hour of the day or night. He had access to outdoor job sites where things could be stored temporarily out of sight. That July, he killed Barbara Jacobs. She was 31. He brought her back to the house for sex, and when she fell asleep, he used the same table leg he'd used on Julie Blackbird. Her body went into a plastic bag. The bag went into a cardboard box, and the box went into the Hudson River. It was found on July 14, still in the box. Then Mary Ellen DeLuca, 22 years old. Her family reported her missing and spent a month waiting. Her body was found in October in a field in Cornwall, New York, upstate, over an hour from the city. He had driven it there. Then Yun Lee, 31 years old. He admitted in a later interview that he knew her beforehand. She was the first victim he had any prior connection to. He folded her body into a steamer trunk and dropped it in the East River off Randall's Island. She was recovered on September 23rd. And then, a few days before Christmas 1991, a woman whose name he could never recall. He strangled her, placed her body into a 55-gallon oil drum he'd taken from a recycling plant where he used to work, drove to the South Bronx, and rolled it into the East River. He later said he almost got caught doing it. A passerby was nearby. He kept moving. He went home. He bought more drums. Between murders, he went home, watched television, had dinner with his mother, woke up the next morning. There was no visible seam between what he was doing and the ordinary surface of his life. His mother moved through that house every day with no idea what her son was. His landscaping clients described him as quiet and punctual. Showed up when he said he would. Did the work. The kind of person you'd struggle to describe in detail an hour after he left. In 1992, the pace increased noticeably. The intervals were shortening, each kill providing less relief than the one before, the compulsion returning faster each time, the whole system beginning to compress around him. Lorraine Orvieto was 28 years old. He killed her in the early part of the year, put her body in an oil drum, dropped it into Coney Island Creek. It wasn't found until July. When police later searched Rifkin's home, they found her driver's license in his possession. He had kept it, along with credit cards, jewelry, and personal items belonging to multiple victims. He was collecting them, not hiding them, keeping them somewhere accessible, in the same house where his mother lived. Iris Sanchez was 25, a crack addict, strangled in May. Her body was left at an illegal dump site 200 feet off Rockaway Boulevard, close enough to JFK Airport that planes passed overhead as the dump sat there in the heat. Anna Lopez was 33, found along the I-84 corridor in May. Violet O'Neill was 21. He brought her back to the house, strangled her, and dismembered her in the bathtub. Marianne Holloman was 39, found in Coney Island Creek in July. Jenny Soto, Leah Evans, Lauren Marquez, And then Mary Catherine Williams, 31 years old, a college graduate, someone he had actually known personally before he killed her. He admitted in a prison interview years later that he strangled her until she lost consciousness, assaulted her, and then killed her. Her credit cards were found in his home. Every other victim was a stranger selected off the street. Mary Catherine Williams was someone whose face he already knew. The investigation had nothing to connect, because nobody knew yet that there was a connection to make. He wasn't fully in control of the timing anymore. The cycle was tightening around him even as he told himself otherwise. By the middle of 1993, the interval between murders had compressed to weeks. 4 years in, he had killed at least 17 women. No victim had ever been formally connected to him. No investigation had surfaced his name. 17 murders across 2 states, and the man responsible was driving a landscaping truck around Long Island, having dinner with his mother, and remaining invisible to every relevant authority. He later said, "As much as I say I wanted to stop, there probably would have been others." Then, June 24th, 1993. Tiffany Bresciani was 22 years old. She had come to New York from Metairie, Louisiana, with the intention of making it as a Broadway actress. She ended up living with her boyfriend Dave Rubenstein, frontman of a hardcore punk band called Reagan Youth, in the way a lot of people in New York City in the early 90s lived, day to day, making it work, on the margins of everything but their own lives. That night she told Dave she'd be back in 20 minutes. He remembered exactly how she said it. Just 20 minutes. He waited. An hour passed. He called the police and gave them a description of the truck she'd got into. A battered pickup. By the time he made that call, Tiffany Bresciani was already dead. Rifkin had driven her to the New York Post's parking lot on South Street and strangled her there. Then, with her body in the back seat of his mother's car, he drove to a hardware store and bought rope and tarpaulin, walked in off the street, browsed the aisles, paid at the till, drove home to East Meadow, moved her body into the garage, put her in a wheelbarrow, and left her there for 3 days. June in New York, temperature in the high 20s, humidity heavy and unrelenting, the kind that sits in a closed space and amplifies everything inside it. A decomposing body in a closed garage in those conditions produces gases within 48 hours that move through walls, that saturate the air of every room nearby, that cannot be mistaken for anything else. His mother was in the house. Whatever those 3 days looked like from inside that home, whatever conversations happened over dinner, whatever ordinary routine continued around what would have been impossible to ignore. It is one of those details that doesn't resolve, no matter how many times you approach it. On June 28th, at 3:15 in the morning, Rifkin loaded Tiffany Bresciani's body into the back of his pickup truck and headed north on the Southern State Parkway. The truck had no rear license plate. Let that sit for a moment. The man who had removed teeth and fingertips from 17 women, who had selected disposal sites in advance across 2 states, who had spent years studying the specific errors that had exposed other killers in his position, was driving down a major highway at 3 in the morning with a decomposing body in the back of his truck. No license plate. 2 state troopers on routine patrol noticed the truck, indicated for him to stop. He didn't. He accelerated. The chase ran for around 20 minutes before he lost control and struck a light pole on Old Country Road in Mineola. The troopers approached the cab. The smell reached them before they got there. One of the troopers, Sean Ruane, later told CNN, "At first he was telling us he didn't know anything about the body in the back, and then he was basically saying he knew she was there but didn't know what happened." That lasted briefly. In the back of the truck, wrapped in tarpaulin, was the body of Tiffany Bresciani, 4 days dead. a missing piece of metal on the back of a truck, 2 officers doing the same job they did every other night. That's what 17 murders and 4 years of careful planning came down to in the end. At the station, Rifkin sat down and talked for hours. Calm throughout, he walked investigators through everything with the register of a man going through a checklist, not performing cooperation, just cooperating, naturally, as though the question of whether to was never something he'd considered. He told them about a howitzer shell he'd bought at a flea market, old military ordnance, dense and heavy, that he'd used to beat one of his earliest victims. Hit her 20, 30 times. Stopped when his arms got tired. She survived it. So he strangled her. He described this the way you might describe trying a different route when the first one was blocked. He described dividing Heidi Balker's body for transport. Arms in one container, legs in another, the head in the paint can, with the vocabulary of a man explaining how to pack a van for a long drive. He led investigators to disposal sites. He confirmed victim identities. He corrected details when he thought they had something wrong. He was, in the language of those interviews, helpful. Detectives who sat through those sessions have described the experience in almost identical terms, regardless of who you ask. It wasn't what he said. It was the total absence of any gap between the man in the room and the things he was describing. The account never slowed. The register never shifted. No moments where the narrative became hard to continue. Just flat, detailed, sustained narration across hours about 17 women and what he had done to each of them. The forensic psychiatrist who assessed him found a man fully connected to reality, aware of what he'd done, aware that it was wrong. What was absent was the interior wiring, the revulsion, the empathy, the mechanism that makes most people physically incapable of causing serious harm to another human being without some fundamental disruption to their own functioning. Whether it was never present or had been overwritten by 2 decades of violent fantasy is a question that doesn't have a clean answer. The outcome was the same either way. A man who described 17 murders with the same affect as 17 unremarkable tasks. In 1994, he was convicted of 9 counts of murder and sentenced to 203 years in prison. He later pleaded guilty to additional counts. He's held at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, the same facility that housed David Berkowitz, eligible for parole in 2019-77, at which point he would theoretically be 238 years old. He still gives interviews, composed, apparently baffled by the expectation that he should be more visibly troubled than he is. He's produced what looks like remorse, said he's sorry, said the right words in the right order. But the forensic professionals who have spent time with him over the years say the same thing consistently. The words are there. What generates those words in a person who means them is not. There are 15 of his victims who have been formally identified. 2 remain unknown. No name, no family notified, a case number and recovered remains and nothing else. They are listed in official records as Jane Doe. They have been listed that way for 30 years. 5 months after his arrest, in November 1993, an episode of Seinfeld aired. Elaine's boyfriend in that episode is named Joel Rifkin, the exact name letter for letter of the man then awaiting trial in New York. The episode plays the name for laughs. Audiences found it funny. It was a well-constructed joke, and they were supposed to. The episode aired while Dave Rubenstein, Tiffany Bresciani's boyfriend, the man who waited that night for her to come back in 20 minutes, was already dead. He had taken his own life by overdose less than 2 weeks after she disappeared. The writers of Seinfeld were writing a joke about a man with an unfortunate name. They had no idea what was sitting directly behind it, which is perhaps the most precise summary of how Joel Rifkin operated for 4 years, in plain sight, in a world that wasn't paying close enough attention. A man so thoroughly unremarkable that everything ordinary, the television shows, the hardware stores, the family dinners, The landscaping clients who found him slightly odd but showed up on time, moved around him without friction, without pausing, without ever looking closely enough at the quiet man with the slow walk who couldn't count to 10 and had a 55-gallon oil drum in the back of his truck. In that 2015 interview, after the pause, after that flat, searching stare, he said some of them couldn't satisfy him. Some of them ridiculed him, so he decided they weren't going to live. The psychiatrist said what stayed with him wasn't the answer. It was what surrounded it. The complete absence of whatever it is that makes saying those words land differently in the mouth of a person who actually understands what they mean. 17 women, 2 of them still without names. A man in a cell in Dannemora who says he's sorry and whose stare has not changed in 30 years. The license plate, by the way, was found in the cab of the truck. He had it with him the entire time. He just hadn't put it on. After 4 years, after 17 murders, after all of it, he just hadn't put it on. Some things don't have a deeper explanation, and sometimes that's the hardest part to sit with. There's something worth returning to about the house in East Meadow. Joel Rifkin lived there with his mother for the better part of his adult life. He moved in and out throughout his 20s and 30s. Jobs that didn't last, money that ran out, the family home pulling him back each time. His mother, Jeanne, was by all accounts a warm and attentive woman who shared her son's love of plants and photography and didn't know her son was a serial killer. She made dinner while evidence of murders sat in her garage. She slept while the smell of a decomposing body 3 days into a June heat settled into the walls around her. The house was searched after his arrest. Police found victim credit cards, victim driver's licenses, personal jewelry belonging to women whose families had been searching for them. All of it stored in a home shared with a woman who had no idea. That is the specific texture of what Joel Rifkin was. Not a man operating in the dark somewhere remote and inaccessible. A man sitting at a dinner table with his mother. A man who watched television on a Tuesday night after disposing of a body on Monday. A man whose neighbors found him unremarkable and whose landscaping clients thought he showed up reliably and whose mother loved him and didn't know. He was also, and this is something that gets lost in the forensic accounting of the crimes, someone who had told investigators things that complicated the clean psychological picture. In one interview, he described the first murder as an experiment. He had a theory that killing a prostitute would cure him of wanting to solicit them. He tested the theory. It didn't work. The framing of murder as a hypothesis, something to be tested, evaluated for results, adjusted if the results were wrong, is either the clearest possible window into how his mind actually worked, or it's a rationalization built after the fact to give shape to something that had no shape at the time. Either way, it tells you something. He also said, at various points over the years, that he thought about stopping, that he was aware the cycle was accelerating, and that he knew at some level it was going to end badly. He said, as much as I say I wanted to stop, there probably would have been others. The would have been is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It means he didn't stop. It means the wanting to stop, if it was ever real, was weaker than the compulsion. It means that whatever he told himself about control, the control was already gone by the time he articulated it. The question of what might have stopped him earlier, before the first murder, before the archive, before the escalation, is one that investigators and psychiatrists and the families of his victims have circled for 30 years without resolution. There were signs in the traditional reading, the dyslexia that shaped his experience of school, the social exclusion that ran from early childhood through adolescence, the fantasy life that developed violent characteristics early and was never interrupted by any intervention. None of those signs were visible from outside the house. The archive was private. The fantasy was internal. The research was done in his bedroom in East Meadow by a man who looked, from every external vantage point, like someone living a quietly failed ordinary life. The school records would have shown a struggling student. The employment history would have shown a man who couldn't hold a job. The psychiatric file, if one had ever existed before the murders, would have shown nothing, because he had never sought help, never disclosed what was building inside him, never given any external system a reason to look more closely. 15 victims formally identified, 2 who remain nameless in official records, 2 whose remains were never recovered at all. Julie Blackbird and the first woman he killed, a woman he referred to in interviews only as Susie, whose body was never found. Whatever disposal method he used for those 2 was effective enough that 30 years of subsequent investigation produced nothing. Dave Rubinstein, Tiffany Bresciani's boyfriend, did not survive the year. Rubinstein was the frontman of a hardcore punk band called Reagan Youth. Tiffany was 22 years old and an aspiring Broadway actress from Metairie, Louisiana, a detail that sits differently once you know it. The distance between what she was working toward and how she died. After her body was found on June 28th, Rubinstein was told what had happened. 3 days later, his mother was killed in a freak accident. His father accidentally struck her with a vehicle at their home in Queens. Within the space of a week, he had lost his girlfriend to a serial killer and his mother to a random tragedy that had nothing to do with any of it. On July 3rd, 1993, he took his own life by overdose. He was 29 years old. They are both gone, and the thread connecting their deaths runs through a man in a cell in Dannemora who says he is sorry and maintains that flat-searching stare. Joel Rifkin was convicted in 1994. The trial involved testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and Rifkin himself, who had already confessed to everything in considerable detail. His defense raised questions about the admissibility of his confession. Investigators had denied his request for a lawyer during the initial interrogation. The confession was admitted. He was convicted on 9 counts, sentenced to 203 years. He later pleaded guilty to additional charges connected to the remaining victims. In prison, he completed a college degree. He has spoken to criminology students and researchers over the years. He corresponds with people who write to him. He is, by the accounts of those who have interacted with him inside, a functional and largely unremarkable prisoner, which makes sense. He was a functional and largely unremarkable person outside. That was always the point. That was the specific thing that made him what he was. The forensic literature on cases like his returns repeatedly to the same observation. The killers who accumulate the highest victim counts are almost never the ones who stand out. They are the ones who don't. The ones who exist just below the threshold of attention. The ones whose neighbors describe them as quiet, and whose employers describe them as unreliable, and whose families describe them as troubled in vague, imprecise ways that don't cohere into a picture anyone acts on. The ones who move through the world generating just enough friction to be slightly noticed and not enough to be actually seen. Joel Rifkin was one of the most effectively invisible people in the history of American crime, not because he was exceptionally clever, not because he had resources or connections or training, but because the world wasn't paying the kind of attention that would have been required to see him. And the women he killed existed in exactly the part of the world where attention was least reliably paid. That is the full picture. A man who built a fantasy over 15 years and then spent 4 years acting on it, 17 times in plain sight, until the one piece of metal that wasn't where it was supposed to be ended it all on a Long Island highway at 3 in the morning. The license plate was in the cab. He had it the whole time. He is 65 years old. He has been in prison for 30 years. The stare, by every account of everyone who has sat across from him, has not changed. The flat, searching quality of it, that look of a man working out a problem he cannot find the answer to, is still there, still present in every interview, still attached to a man who said 30 years ago, and again in 2015, and presumably would say again today, that he is sorry, that he knows what he did was wrong, that he wishes he could take it back. The psychiatrist in that 2015 interview said afterwards that what he kept returning to was not the words. It was the space around the words, the absence of anything underneath them that would make them mean what they were supposed to mean. 17 women, 2 still without names, a man in a cell until 2197, and a license plate sitting in the cab the whole time. The next case, Wesley Allen Dodd. A 6-year-old boy is screaming in the lobby of a movie theatre. A man is carrying him toward the exit. One arm locked around the child's body, moving fast, head down. People stare. A few seconds pass. And then, something shifts. A bystander grabs the man. The child breaks free. And the man who had been walking calmly toward the door suddenly becomes the most wanted person in the Pacific Northwest. His name was Wesley Allen Dodd, and the only reason anyone caught him that night is because a terrified child fought back, because up until that moment, Dodd had been completely invisible. That is perhaps the most disturbing thing about this story, not just what he did, but how long he did it, and how little the world noticed. Wesley Dodd was born on July 3, 1961, in Toppenish, Washington. Ordinary town, ordinary street, ordinary-looking man who would grow up to become anything but. He was the eldest of 3 children, and in later years he would describe a loveless home, parents who fought, a father who showed favoritism, a childhood without warmth. He spoke about this often to investigators, to journalists, to anyone who would listen, and it is worth saying clearly, none of it explains what he became. Millions of people survive difficult childhoods without ever harming a single soul. Dodd's upbringing is not a reason. It is simply the opening chapter of a story that gets far darker, because by the age of 9, Dodd already knew he was drawn to young boys in ways that were deeply wrong, and rather than carry that in silence or seek help or do anything other than act on it, he began to orbit children like a predator circling prey. By 13, he was exposing himself to kids in the neighborhood, cycling the same streets on a bicycle his parents had given him for Christmas, choosing targets who were small and alone. He had at least 10 victims before his 14th birthday. His own father would later admit to a newspaper that he had known about the behavior. He had largely ignored it. His son didn't drink, didn't do drugs, otherwise well behaved. That detail says everything it needs to say. By 14, Dodd had begun committing serious offenses against his own younger cousins, children aged 6 and 8. He volunteered as a babysitter. He positioned himself as a camp counselor. He inserted himself wherever access to children existed, quietly, without drawing attention. At 15, police arrested him for indecent exposure and released him with a recommendation for counseling. He attended counseling. He kept offending. At 18, he attempted to abduct 2 young girls. Police were informed. No action was taken. He joined the Navy at 20, was stationed in Bangor, Washington, and immediately began targeting children living on the base, approaching them in theater restrooms in Seattle, using money to lure them to secluded places. Arrested, discharged, arrested again. 19 days in jail, released, arrested again, released again. By 1986, Wesley Allen Dodd had harmed no fewer than 30 children, by the most conservative estimates. Some researchers put the true figure closer to 175. In all of that time, across all of those victims, he had never once served a sentence longer than 4 months. And here is where the story takes a turn That makes the stomach drop, because Dodd himself had begun to notice something shifting inside him. What he had done to children was no longer enough. The fantasies were growing darker, more violent, more elaborate. He had started thinking about killing, not as something that might happen, but as something he was moving toward deliberately. In 1987, he approached an 8-year-old boy with a story about a lost child, attempting to lure him away. The boy's instincts saved him. He went home and told his mother. Dodd was charged. He served 118 days. Then he was free again. He moved to Vancouver, Washington in 1989. He had a job. He had an apartment. He had a briefcase under his bed, a diary on his desk, a knife he kept deliberately sharpened, and coils of shoelaces he carried on his person wherever he went. He was not a man in crisis. He was a man with a plan. On the afternoon of September 4th, 1989, Dodd walked into David Douglas Park. He spotted 2 brothers almost immediately, Cole Neer, 11 years old, and his younger brother William, 10. 2 kids on a bike path, doing what children do on warm September afternoons. Dodd approached them with the ease of a man who had been doing this his entire adult life. He guided them off the trail into a wooded area. He used the shoelaces. He tied them to a tree. He subjected both boys to serious crimes against them. And then, without hurry, he drew a fish-fillet knife and stabbed them. Methodically, repeatedly. Cole died at the scene. William died on the way to the hospital. Dodd walked home. He ate. He slept. He wrote it all down in his diary. Then he cut out the newspaper clippings and added them to a scrapbook. Police had little to work with. No witnesses, no obvious suspect. The park offered almost nothing. The community was gripped by fear, and Dodd moved through it entirely unnoticed. He went to work. He came home. He sat at his desk and filled his diary. Not with guilt, not with conflict, but with calculations. How to control a victim more effectively. How to make it last longer. He began constructing, with his own hands, a homemade wooden rack, a device built specifically for restraint and prolonged suffering. He worked on it in the evenings, steadily, with the focus of a man who considered it a project worth finishing. 7 weeks passed. On October 29, 1989, Dodd drove to a school playground in Portland, Oregon. He saw a small boy playing alone near the equipment. The child was 4 years old. His name was Lee Iseli. Dodd approached him gently. He told Lee he was going to take him somewhere fun. Lee went with him. He was 4 years old. Children trust adults the way the sky trusts gravity, instinctively, completely, without any reason not to. Dodd drove him back across the state line to his apartment in Vancouver. He told the boy to be very quiet because the neighbor lady didn't like children. Lee nodded. He was doing his best to understand a world that had just turned completely against him. That night, Dodd took the boy to McDonald's. He took him to Kmart and bought him a toy. And then he brought him home, tied him to the bed, and subjected him to hours of serious harm. He kept Lee through the night. He photographed him. He wrote about him in the diary, not with remorse, not with conflict, but with a cold, meticulous satisfaction that is almost impossible to read without feeling something fundamental break inside you. And at some point, deep in the night, he woke the sleeping child and told him plainly, "I'm going to kill you in the morning." He did. He strangled Lee Isley first, until the boy lost consciousness, then waited, then strangled him again. Then he hung the child's body from a rod inside the closet. He photographed that too. Then he wrapped Lee in trash bags, drove to a wooded area near Vancouver Lake, and discarded him in the bushes like he was nothing. He burned the child's clothing in a barrel behind his building. He kept one thing, a tiny pair of Ghostbusters underwear. He put them in the briefcase under his bed, beside the photographs. Lee's body was found 3 days later, the city fractured with grief and fear. a manhunt began, and Dodd stayed in his apartment, writing new plans, working on the torture rack, watching the news coverage of himself with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose work was being noticed. But he couldn't stop. He never intended to. 2 weeks after Lee Esley's murder, on November 13th, Dodd drove to the New Liberty Theatre in Camas, Washington. There was a children's showing that afternoon. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. He found 6-year-old James Kirk II in the restroom. He grabbed the boy and walked toward the exit, carrying him under one arm, the child screaming and thrashing against him. The lobby was busy. People were watching. A man named William Ray Graves saw exactly what was happening and moved to block him. The child broke free. Dodd tried to run. He didn't get far. At the police station, he was nervous, but initially composed. He admitted to the attempted abduction. He claimed he had only intended to harm the child briefly in the restroom, as though that were a lesser thing to confess. Detectives from both Washington and Oregon sat across the table from him. They looked at his record. They looked at where he lived, directly adjacent to David Douglas Park. They looked at where he worked, close to the site where Lee Esley's body had been recovered. The geography alone was damning before he said a single useful word. And then, as the hours wore on, Dodd began to talk, not reluctantly, not under pressure. He became almost eager. He described what he had done with precise, unhurried detail, and the more he spoke, the more visibly disturbed the detectives became. Not because he was difficult to read, but because he wasn't. He was transparent in the most horrifying way possible. He directed them to the apartment, to the diary, to the torture rack, to the briefcase under the bed. Inside that briefcase, beside the photographs, were Lee Esley's Ghostbusters underwear. The diary was read aloud in court. Grown men wept. Photographs were displayed that should never have existed. The defense offered no witnesses and presented no evidence. Their only argument was that no sane person could have done this, which forced the jury to sit with the unbearable conclusion that a perfectly sane person had. Dodd pleaded guilty to all 3 murders. At sentencing, he stood before the judge and told the court without theatre, without remorse, that if he were ever released, he would do everything within his power to kill again. He would attempt escape. He would kill prison guards if he had to. He asked to be executed. He asked specifically to be hanged, because he said that was how Lee Esley had died. The state of Washington agreed. On January 5th, 1993, just after midnight, Wesley Allen Dodd was walked to the gallows at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, the first legal hanging in the United States in 28 years. His last words were something about hope and peace and faith. Whether that was genuine or one final act of performance for an audience he could feel watching, no living person can say. The drop took seconds. Researchers who later studied his case placed him at level 22 on the most evil scale, the absolute ceiling, not for the number of victims, but for the combination of sustained predatory intelligence, methodical cruelty, and the complete and total absence of anything resembling a conscience. He had been arrested repeatedly across 2 decades. He had told counselors, judges, and parole officers precisely what he was. He had written it down in his own hand in extraordinary detail. And every system designed to stop people like him had simply moved him along. The Near brothers are buried in the Pacific Northwest. Lee Esley was 4 years old. His Ghostbusters underwear sat in a briefcase under a man's bed for weeks, while his family searched for him. Some things once known cannot be made smaller. This is one of them. The next case, David Van Dyke. There is something that every single one of his victims did, that you would have done too. They opened the door. That's it. That's all it took. A knock, a face. A reason so small and ordinary that turning him away would have felt almost impolite. And in that moment, in the half second of basic human decency it takes to step aside and say, "Come in." 6 people in Milwaukee, Wisconsin made the last decision of their lives because David Van Dyke had spent years studying that moment, that pause, that instinct to trust. He had learned, the way a hunter learns the habits of its prey, exactly how much it takes to get a door to open. He never needed anything more than that. He was born in Milwaukee on January 14, 1959, one of 5 children, into a household that was already coming apart before he arrived. His mother couldn't hold it together, so his grandmother took him in. She was, by every account, the only person who ever tried to build something stable around him. And then, when David was 6 years old, she died. Just like that, the one anchor he had was gone, and he moved back in with his mother, and whatever small chance had existed for him closed like a door. He never went back through it. By the time he was a teenager, the shape of what he was becoming was already visible to everyone around him. He dropped out after 7th grade. He beat up smaller children in the neighborhood and paid bigger ones not to do the same to him. A transaction that reveals something cold about the way his mind worked even then. He understood that the world ran on vulnerability. He threatened his own niece with a knife. He stole from his mother regularly, without guilt, without hesitation, as though it were a tax she owed him simply for existing. And then there was the bird. He took some of that stolen money and bought himself a canary, something small and alive and completely at his mercy. He strangled it to death with his bare hands, and he laughed while he did it, not from rage, not from some childhood crisis of emotion. He laughed the way you laugh at something that amuses you, the way you laugh when something goes exactly as planned. That was not a troubled child acting out. That was a preview. He grew into a man who drifted, never held a job, earned maybe $600 a month through pool hustling and burglary, slept in cars, slept in abandoned buildings, moved through Milwaukee like a ghost who decided to stay. He'd spent years perfecting the art of entering spaces that didn't belong to him, learning which doors gave way, which excuses worked, which face to wear. In April 1979, he was paroled after a burglary conviction and released back onto the streets with nothing to his name. He had been practicing for years. He just hadn't found his real purpose yet. 3 months after his release, he knocked on Delamay Liggins' door and found it. Delamay was 69 years old. She lived alone on the north side, in one of those tight residential streets where people still largely trusted each other, where a stranger at the door in the middle of a summer afternoon wasn't yet cause for alarm. It was July 19th, 1979, the kind of day that feels safe. Van Dyke had a reason for being there, something small, something reasonable. We don't know exactly what he said. We know it worked. She let him in. She was stabbed to death inside her own home. Van Dyke took whatever money he could find, stepped back out into the afternoon sun, and walked away. No panic, no running, just a man leaving. The city had no idea what had just begun. 3 weeks later, it got worse. Florence Burkhardt was 78 years old, and she lived on the same side of the city. And she made the same mistake, not because she was careless, but because Van Dyke was careful. He arrived at her door with a story that worked. She opened it. And what followed was not the work of a man in the grip of blind rage. It was prolonged, considered. He found a pair of scissors somewhere in that house, and he drove them into Florence Burkhardt's body 43 times. Not twice, not 5 times, 43. The wound that killed her punctured her heart. The attack began in the kitchen, and by the end of it, she was at the bottom of her basement stairs. And that is where 2 charity volunteers found her later that afternoon. 2 people who came every week to deliver a hot meal to an elderly woman they cared about, who knocked on her door and stepped inside and then stopped. The meal went cold on the table. Police were investigating now, working both scenes. pulling what they could from the evidence. They found partial fingerprints, matched them to nothing. They had a killer and no face and no name, and a city going about its business, completely unaware. And Van Dyke knew that. He could feel it, the way a man feels the absence of pursuit. He didn't flee, didn't change his patterns. He stayed in the same neighborhood, moved through the same streets, patient and steady as weather. 3 months of silence. Then, on the 8th of November, 1979, Helen Wronski, 79 years old, East Side Milwaukee, was beaten to death in her own living room. And here is the detail that tells you something the case files alone cannot. When it was over, Van Dyke didn't leave. He pulled a sheet over her body, slowly, quietly, the way you'd cover someone sleeping. Then he walked into her bedroom and searched through her dresser, found nothing worth taking, and left. That sheet, that careful, deliberate gesture, it wasn't remorse, it wasn't guilt, it was something far more unsettling. A man so completely at ease in the presence of what he'd done that he had time for ritual. Fingerprints again, no match. The case was going nowhere. And Van Dyke, somewhere on the other side of that investigation, was accelerating. January 25th, 1980. A man named Charles Golston was found inside his home by a friend, face down, unconscious, breathing but barely, his skull fractured by a claw hammer that Van Dyke had left on the floor beside him. He was 63 years old, and he was rushed to hospital and placed in a coma. And he stayed there. 3 months, 90-some days of machines and dim light, and a family rotating through a hospital waiting room, while the man who put him there was already back on the street, already looking, already moving toward the next door. Charles Golston died in early May, without ever opening his eyes again. He never got to know who did it. 6 weeks after the attack on Golston, Bernard Fonda was dead too. But the story of how Fonda died, that story carries a particular weight that nothing else in this case quite matches. Fonda was 49 years old. He had a former roommate who had beaten him badly the previous December, badly enough that Fonda had thrown him out. But then February came, and the roommate had nowhere to go, and Fonda, against his better instincts, let him back in. Something in him knew that was a mistake. And so, a few days before the end of his life, Bernard Fonda sat down and wrote a note. He put a name on it, and an address and an explanation, walked downstairs to his neighbors, pressed it into their hands, and told them, "If something happens to me, give this to the police." It is one of the most haunting acts of foresight in this entire story. A man who sensed death coming, who couldn't name it or stop it, but left a trail of breadcrumbs just in case. On March 3rd, 1980, Fonda was found dead on his bed, skull beaten in. His neighbors kept their promise. The note went to the police. The roommate was arrested and charged with murder. For a brief, almost cruel moment, it looked like the case was solved. Then the fingerprints came back. The roommate didn't match. Van Dyke had killed Bernard Fonda and walked out of that apartment, leaving behind evidence that pointed at a completely different man. The wrong person sat in a cell. The right one was already hunting again. And if there is a line in this story that tells you exactly what kind of world Van Dyke moved through, a world where a man's final act of foresight still wasn't enough, that is it. By April 1980, 9 months had passed since Delamay Liggins. 6 people were dead or dying, and the investigation had nothing solid. And Van Dyke was still out there, moving through the same tight geography of northern Milwaukee, knocking on doors. He was not devolving. He was not unraveling. If anything, he was getting more comfortable. And then, on April 14th, he made his first real mistake, though he didn't know it yet. A 28-year-old woman had placed an advert selling her car. Van Dyke arrived at her door and told her he was interested in buying it. She let him in. They talked. She went upstairs to find something, and he followed her. Unhurried, quiet, just a man walking up a staircase. When she turned around and found him standing right behind her, something changed in the room before he even moved. He grabbed her by the throat. He tried to throw her to the ground but tripped, and she fell instead of being slammed. She hit the floor, and he was on her immediately, standing over her, stomping on her head with a force and a focus that had nothing frantic in it. She got back up. Something in him seemed almost surprised. He swung her ashtray into the side of her head and it shattered. And then he crouched down beside her and picked up the broken pieces and began drawing them across her arms, cutting her, slowly, with a calm that had nothing frantic in it, running his fingers along the wounds he was making, tracing them, as though he was studying something. She ran. She got out of the house and pounded on the nearest neighbor's door. It opened a crack. A face appeared, took in the blood, the state of her, the desperation, and closed the door. She ran to a tavern. She got help. She survived. Van Dyke left with $118. 11 days later, Helen Louise Bellamy opened her door. Helen Louise Bellamy was 30 years old. She had a son, 13 years old, who left for school that morning the way he always did, and came home that afternoon the way he always did, and walked through the front door of their home on the north side, and found his mother's body in the dining room. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a tire jack. She was partially covered with a sheet. That same sheet, that same ritual. 5 murders in, and Van Dyke was still taking that moment, still pausing over the body of someone he had just destroyed, still reaching for something to cover them with. Make of that what you will. Nobody has ever been able to explain it. What is certain is that it was deliberate. Everything he did was deliberate. Helen Bellamy was the 6th. She was the last. The detectives had been quietly building for months, mapping the geography of the murders, cataloguing the methods, pulling together the partial fingerprints recovered from 2 separate scenes. Someone made a call that would break the case open, run those prints against every burglary suspect on file in Milwaukee. Not just the obvious ones, every single one. On May 23, 1980, David Van Dyke was arrested for an attempted burglary. Routine, unremarkable. His fingerprints were taken as a matter of course. They matched. He was brought into an interrogation room and questioned for hours, and at some point the weight of it, or the certainty of it, got through to him. He began to cry, and then he talked. He confessed to the murders one by one, in a room with detectives who had spent months chasing a ghost, now sitting 3 feet away from the real thing. The trial opened in February 1981. His surviving victim took the stand on the very first day and told the jury everything. The staircase, the stomping, the glass, his fingers moving along her arms while she bled. She looked at the man who had done it, and she said what happened. Every word of it. Then Van Dyke, against the explicit advice of his own attorney, stood up and took the stand himself. He admitted to 200 burglaries without blinking, but he had never hurt anyone, he said. Never. When confronted during a break-in, he always ran. The woman with the ashtray, she had cut him first, he told them, with a broken vase. He was defending himself. The cuts on her arms were from her falling on a bottle. And the confessions the detectives had in writing, were fabricated, every word. He looked at that jury and asked them, with what appeared to be complete sincerity, how a man could possibly confess to crimes he had no memory of. The jury went away and came back in 4.5 hours. Guilty, on all of it. 6 life sentences, 40 additional years. The longest prison term ever handed down in the state of Wisconsin at that time, surpassing even a mass murderer who had come before him. He was taken to Walpun Correctional Institution, where he sits today. and he will not see a parole hearing until 2048, when he will be 89 years old. 6 people died in their own homes, behind their own doors, at the hands of a man who asked for almost nothing before he took everything. 1 woman survived and has carried the memory of his fingers on her wounds for over 40 years. A 13-year-old boy walked into a room that changed him forever, and nobody who knew Helen Bellamy gets to stop knowing how she died. And somewhere in Milwaukee, 2 volunteers are still standing in a doorway in the summer of 1979, holding a hot meal, looking down a flight of stairs, and understanding that the world that they walked into that afternoon is not the one they are going to walk out of. Van Dyke strangled his first living creature as a child, something small and warm that trusted him completely, that had no idea what was coming, that felt safe right up until it didn't. He bought it with stolen money. He held it in his hands, and he squeezed the life out of it while he laughed. Some people never outgrow what they are. He just found larger doors to knock on. The next case, the Cleveland torso murders. The nude, decapitated corpse rolled down the muddy embankment and splashed into the shallow water of Kingsbury Run. It was September 23rd, 1935, and 2 young boys cutting through the Cleveland ravine on their way home from school were about to stumble upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But here's what made their discovery even more disturbing. This wasn't the first headless body, and it wouldn't be the last. To understand how Cleveland became the hunting ground for one of America's most prolific and mysterious serial killers, you need to understand what the city looked like in the 1930s. The Great Depression had gutted the American economy, and nowhere was this more visible than in the industrial cities of the Midwest. Cleveland, once a booming manufacturing hub with steel mills and factories that employed tens of thousands, had been brought to its knees. Unemployment had reached catastrophic levels. Families were being evicted from their homes daily. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. And the desperate, the forgotten, the people who'd fallen through society's cracks, they all ended up in the same place, Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run was a deep ravine that cut through the southeast side of Cleveland, a natural drainage basin where Kingsbury Creek flowed sluggishly toward the Cuyahoga River. In better times, it had been just another geographical feature of the city, a place where kids played and couples took walks on summer evenings. But by the mid-1930s, it had transformed into something else entirely, a shanty town, a hobo jungle. Hundreds of makeshift shacks constructed from scrapwood, tar paper, and corrugated metal lined the ravine. Repurposed rail cars sat on rusted tracks, their insides converted into crude living spaces. Cooking fires burned in oil drums. Laundry hung on lines strung between trees. It was a sprawling community of homeless men and women who lived completely off the grid, outside the boundaries of normal society. There were no addresses in Kingsbury Run, no records, no one keeping track of who came and went. Men would hop off freight trains, live in the run for weeks or months, then hop another train and disappear. Others were permanent residents, too broken by life to move on. It was a place where you could disappear and no one would notice, no one would care, no one would file a missing person report or go looking for you. And someone was about to take advantage of that fact in the most horrific way imaginable. The 2 boys who made that discovery, their names were James Wagner and Peter Kostura, and they were just cutting through the run like they did most days after school. It was a shortcut, a way to avoid the longer route through the city streets. The steep slopes of the ravine were covered in scrub brush and weeds that had grown wild throughout the summer. As they scrambled down the embankment, their school books clutched under their arms. One of them spotted something pale in the shallow water below. From a distance, it looked artificial, like a department store mannequin someone had tossed into the creek. That's what most people's brains do when they see something they can't quite process. They rationalize it into something normal, something explainable. But as the boys got closer, sliding down the last few feet of muddy slope, the smell hit them. If you've never smelled decomposing human flesh, there's no way to adequately describe it. It's sweet and rotten at the same time, almost chemical, like meat that's gone bad, mixed with something that triggers an immediate visceral reaction. It gets into your nose and throat and stays there. It's a smell that makes your body react before your brain fully understands what you're smelling. The boys stopped. One of them probably grabbed the other's arm, and then they saw it clearly. The pale thing in the water wasn't a mannequin. It was a body, a human body, naked, and it didn't have a head. The corpse was that of a young man, maybe in his 20s, with a lean build. He was lying face down in the water, or he would have been face down if he'd had a face. Instead, there was just a clean stump where his neck ended. His arms were gone too, severed at the shoulders with cuts so clean they almost looked surgical. The water around the body was clear. No blood. The boys ran faster than they'd ever run in their lives, scrambling back up that embankment, sprinting to the nearest house with a telephone. Cleveland police arrived within the hour, and what started as a single body discovery quickly became something much worse. While officers were processing the first scene, one of them spotted something about 30 feet upstream, another body, same condition, headless, naked, arms removed. The genital area had been mutilated, the penis and testicles cleanly removed. Both bodies were male. Both appeared to be in their 20s or early 30s, and both had clearly been dead for several days. But here's what made the responding officer's blood run cold. There was almost no blood at the scene. When you decapitate a human being, when you remove their limbs, there should be massive amounts of blood. It should be everywhere. But at this crime scene, there was barely any, which meant only one thing. These men hadn't been killed here. They'd been murdered somewhere else, somewhere private, somewhere the killer could take all the time he needed. Then their bodies had been dumped in Kingsbury Run like trash. The coroner's examination revealed details that made even seasoned detectives uncomfortable. The decapitations had been performed with remarkable skill. Instead of hacking through bone, the killer had carefully separated the vertebrae, cutting through the soft tissue between the bones. This required anatomical knowledge, the kind of knowledge a doctor would have, or a butcher, or maybe someone who'd worked as a medic in the military. The bodies had been washed clean, scrubbed of any trace evidence, and both victims had been dead for approximately 3 to 5 days before being discovered. Their bodies left somewhere cool to slow decomposition before being dumped. But here's the detail that really sent a chill through the Cleveland Police Department. These weren't the first bodies, not even close. A year earlier, in September 1934, a woman's torso had washed up on the shore of Lake Erie at Euclid Beach. Just the lower half of her torso. No head, no arms, no legs. The body had been in the water for a while, and investigators had assumed it was some kind of isolated incident. They'd investigated half-heartedly, and when no other body parts turned up, the case went cold. Now, with 2 more dismembered bodies, the Cleveland police had to consider they might be dealing with something much worse. A serial killer. Someone who was selecting victims, killing them in private, dismembering them with surgical precision, and dumping the parts around Cleveland. This was 1935. The term serial killer wouldn't even be coined for another 40 years. But that's exactly what Cleveland had on its hands. The investigation fell primarily to Detective Peter Merillo, a hardened veteran of the Cleveland Police Department who'd seen just about everything during his 20-year career. Merillo was tough, relentless, the kind of cop who worked cases until they were solved, no matter how long it took. He looked at the 2 bodies from Kingsbury Run and knew immediately this was going to be the most difficult case of his career. The victims had no identifying features. Their fingerprints weren't on file anywhere. They had no dental work that could be matched to records. And most crucially, no one was looking for them. These were transients, drifters, people who existed on the margins of society. Merillo began spending his nights in Kingsbury Run, sometimes in uniform, sometimes dressed as a hobo, trying to blend in with the transient population. He'd sit around fires with the homeless men, sharing cigarettes, listening to their stories, trying to understand if anyone had noticed people disappearing. But the shanty town was a constantly shifting population. Men came and went like ghosts. Keeping track of who was there and who wasn't was essentially impossible. Then, in January 1936, the killer struck again. A woman's remains were discovered in 2 baskets behind a butcher shop in downtown Cleveland. Her body had been cut into 7 pieces and stuffed into the baskets with old newspapers. Her head was found nearby in a burlap sack. Unlike the previous victims, this woman could be identified. Her name was Florence Polillo, and she was a prostitute and barmaid who worked the rougher sections of Cleveland. She was 41 years old. She'd been dead for approximately 2 to 4 days when discovered. The medical examiner's report made for grim reading. She'd been decapitated while still alive, the cause of death being exsanguination, bleeding to death. The dismemberment had occurred after death, performed with the same precision as the previous victims. Her body had been completely drained of blood, and chemical analysis suggested she'd been washed, possibly with industrial soap. The killer was thorough, methodical. He was covering his tracks. Detective Merillo now had 3 connected cases, 5 victims total. He started building a profile. The killer had medical or anatomical knowledge. He had access to a private location, probably a basement where he wouldn't be disturbed. He had means to transport bodies around the city, and he was selecting victims from the margins of society. Merillo theorized the killer might be a doctor, a butcher, or someone with military medical training. The list of potential suspects was enormous. By June 1936, the newspapers had caught wind of the story, and Cleveland was starting to panic. The city was hosting the Great Lakes Exposition, a World's Fair designed to showcase Cleveland's recovery from the Depression. The last thing city officials wanted was headlines about a serial killer, but that's exactly what they got when 2 more bodies turned up. On June 5th, 1936, 2 boys found a man's head wrapped in trousers under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. The head belonged to a young man between 20 and 25. His head had been severed cleanly between the vertebrae. The search that followed turned up more body parts scattered throughout Kingsbury Run. His torso was found several hundred feet away, completely drained of blood. His arms and legs were discovered nearby. What made this murder stand out was what they found during autopsy. The victim had been alive when the killer began working on him. There were restraint marks on his wrists and ankles, deep bruising indicating he'd been tied down for hours or days. Chemical analysis showed traces of what might have been a sedative in his system. The killer wasn't just murdering these people quickly. He was keeping them alive, restraining them. And then, methodically, he was taking them apart. 6 days later, they discovered another body, a man's torso badly decomposed lying in the brush below Kingsbury Run. This victim had been dead for at least a month. The summer heat had accelerated decomposition. Like the others, he'd been decapitated, dismembered, and drained of blood. Detective Merillo now had 7 victims, and he was no closer to catching the killer. The pressure on the Cleveland Police Department was immense. The mayor was demanding results. The newspapers were running daily stories about the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run and the torso murderer. Citizens were terrified, and into this chaos stepped a man who would become synonymous with law enforcement in 1930s America, Elliot Ness. Ness had been appointed Cleveland's Director of Public Safety in August 1935, brought in specifically to clean up the city's police corruption and tackle organized crime. He was famous for being the federal agent who'd taken down Al Capone, leading the Untouchables. Ness was supposed to be Cleveland's savior, but now he found himself facing a killer unlike anything he'd ever dealt with. Organized crime, he understood. Bootleggers operated according to certain rules, certain patterns. But this was something else entirely. Ness threw resources at the case. He consulted with experts from across the country. He brought in Dr. Royal Grossman, one of the leading forensic scientists of the era. He ordered massive sweeps of Kingsbury Run, trying to find witnesses, trying to gather any information that might lead to the killer. But everything came up empty. The killer left no fingerprints. No witnesses ever came forward. The bodies were dumped where no one would see. It was like fighting a ghost. July 1936 brought another victim. A man's torso, again found in Kingsbury Run, again decapitated and dismembered with surgical precision. The victim had been dead for at least 2 months. Murillo was working 20-hour days, following up on hundreds of tips that all led nowhere. He investigated doctors who'd had their licenses revoked. He looked at butchers with criminal records. Nothing connected. Then came September 1936. Another headless, limbless torso, this one belonging to a man in his 30s. The body had been in Kingsbury Run for at least 2 months before being found. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Clean cuts, drained of blood, no identifying features. The investigation took a haunting turn in February 1937. The upper half of a woman's torso washed up on the beach at East 30th Street. Her lower torso and arms were found separately over the next few days, and then her head was recovered. For the first time, investigators got a good look at one of the victims' faces. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with reddish blonde hair and attractive features. She'd been dead for approximately 4 months before washing ashore. The Cleveland police created a death mask of her face, a plaster cast that captured her features perfectly. They circulated photographs throughout Ohio and neighboring states. Someone had to know who she was. But despite thousands of inquiries, no one ever identified her. She became known as the Lady of the Lake. And her death mask is still on display in the Cleveland Police Museum to this day. By now, the torso murders were national news. Newspapers across the country were running stories. True crime magazines sent reporters to cover the case, and the pressure on Elliot Ness became unbearable. He was supposed to be the incorruptible lawman who brought down Capone, but he couldn't catch a killer operating right under his nose. June 1937 brought the discovery of a woman's skeleton under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge, the same location where an earlier victim's head had been found. The skeleton was missing its head, and forensic analysis suggested it had been there for at least a year. Then in July, the dismembered remains of a man were found floating in the Cuyahoga River, wrapped in burlap and tied with rope. The victim had distinctive tattoos that helped identify him as 23-year-old Robert Robertson, a drifter from Michigan. The identification of Robertson was significant because it meant the killer hadn't completely stripped away the victim's identity. But despite tracking down Robertson's known associates and retracing his movements, the investigation hit another dead end. No one had seen anything suspicious. The murders stopped for several months, and there was growing hope that maybe the killer had stopped. Maybe he'd died. Maybe he'd moved away. But those hopes were shattered on April 8th, 1938, when a woman's leg was found floating in the Cuyahoga River. Over the next few days, more body parts surfaced. A torso, an arm, another leg, and then her head, found inside 2 burlap sacks. The victim appeared to be in her 20s or 30s, but again, No identification could be made. The killer had come back. But the discovery that truly broke Cleveland happened on August 16, 1938. A dump site at East 9th and Lakeshore Drive became the scene of the most horrific discovery yet. 3 dismembered bodies, 3 separate victims, all found in the same location. 2 were female, 1 was male. They'd been wrapped in brown paper and an old quilt. They'd been dead for approximately 4 to 6 months. The decomposition was so advanced that determining basic facts about them proved difficult, but the dismemberment style was unmistakable. 3 bodies at once changed everything. It meant the killer was either accelerating, or he'd been storing bodies and decided to dump them all at once. Either scenario was terrifying. The thought that somewhere in Cleveland there was a place where this person kept dismembered bodies was almost too disturbing to contemplate. Eliot Ness made a controversial decision. On August 18, 1938, he ordered a massive raid on the Kingsbury Run shantytown. Hundreds of police officers swarmed the area, burning down shacks, arresting transients, and effectively clearing out the entire settlement. Ness believed that either the killer was living among the homeless population, or his victims came from there, and by eliminating the shantytown, he could stop the murders. And it seemed to work. The murders stopped. For months, then years. No more bodies turned up with the signature dismemberment. Some investigators believed Ness's aggressive action had scared the killer away. Others thought maybe the killer had been among those arrested and was now in prison for some other crime. Some believed he died or moved to another city. But there was one final victim. On August 16, 1942, exactly 4 years after the 3 bodies were found at the lakefront, a male torso was pulled from the Cuyahoga River. The head and limbs had been removed with the same precision as the earlier victims. The body had been in the water for several months. This final victim was never identified, and after that, the torso murderer vanished completely. Detective Merillo never stopped investigating. He spent decades following leads, trying to find the killer who'd haunted him. He investigated over 5,000 men, but none of them panned out. Eliot Ness had his own suspect, a doctor named Francis Sweeney. Sweeney was a surgeon who'd served in World War I and had subsequently fallen into alcoholism and homelessness. He had the medical knowledge to perform the precise dismemberments, and he'd been institutionalized around the time the murders stopped. Ness actually had Sweeney brought in for questioning and subjected him to polygraph tests administered by the famous polygraph expert Leonard Keeler. According to some accounts, Sweeney failed the polygraph multiple times when asked about the murders. But there was a problem. Sweeney came from a prominent Cleveland family, including a congressman, and there wasn't enough physical evidence to charge him. After the questioning, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital, where he remained for much of the rest of his life. After Ness died in 1957, Sweeney allegedly sent him taunting postcards, but these have never been verified. Other suspects emerged over the years. There was Frank Dolezal, a bricklayer who knew Florence Polillo. Police arrested him in 1939, and after days of brutal interrogation, Dolezal confessed to killing Polillo. But his confession was clearly coerced, filled with details that didn't match the crime scene. While awaiting trial, Dolezal was found hanged in his jail cell under suspicious circumstances. The sheriff ruled it suicide, but many believed Dolezal had been murdered to cover up the interrogation tactics. Regardless, Dolezal didn't match the profile for the other murders. The Cleveland torso murders remain unsolved to this day. In total, the official count was 12 victims, though some investigators believed there could have been as many as 20 or more. Most of the victims were never identified. They remain nameless, buried in unmarked graves. 6 were men, 6 were women. Most came from the margins of society. The location of the actual murder site, the place where the killer performed the dismemberments, was never found. Despite extensive searches of buildings, basements, and facilities throughout Cleveland, investigators never discovered the room where the killer drained his victims' blood and carefully cut them apart. That room existed somewhere in Cleveland during the 1930s, and it was never found. What made this case particularly haunting is how completely the killer vanished. Serial killers typically follow patterns until they're caught, die, or are incarcerated. But the torso murderer just stopped. Either he died, moved away, was institutionalized, or possessed the extraordinary self-control to simply quit killing. The precision of the cut suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, possibly a doctor, butcher, or someone with military medical training. The complete drainage of blood indicated access to equipment and a location where large amounts of blood could be disposed of without detection. The killer had to have transportation to move the body parts to the dump sites. All of these factors point to someone established, someone with resources, someone who lived a normal life while secretly dismembering human beings. The shantytown in Kingsbury Run is long gone, replaced by industrial buildings and rail yards. The beaches where body parts washed up are now parks where families picnic. The bridges where heads were found still stand, carrying thousands of commuters every day. Cleveland has moved on, built itself back up, become a modern American city. But the torso murderer's legacy remains. The nameless victims got small markers years later, simple stones that read unknown, followed by a number. They deserved better. They deserved to have their names remembered, their lives honored, their deaths solved. Instead, they became statistics, case numbers, mysteries that frustrated generations of investigators. Detective Peter Merillo died in 1958, still haunted by the case he could never solve. Eliot Ness died in 1957, his autobiography barely mentioning the torso murders, perhaps because they represented his greatest failure. Francis Sweeney died in 1965, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. And somewhere out there, in some forgotten corner of Cleveland, or in some dusty cemetery far from Ohio, the real Cleveland torso murderer rests, his identity unknown, his crimes unpunished, having gotten away with one of the most horrific murder sprees in American history.